What would you do if you woke up and found through some horrific circumstance you'd been buried alive? This is the stuff of nightmares only. Couldn't happen in real life. Could it? Hello, I'm Peter John Cooper. For once, today's 10-minute tale is a true story. I came across this many years ago when I was writing a play with an old friend called Jem Barnes. This horrific and tragic story is exactly as we learnt it at the time. The summer of 1674 was very hot, and as such it caused a lot of discomfort to those trapped in the fetid, sweltering air of the small Hampshire town of Basingstoke. Alice Blunden was the wife of a prominent citizen, William Blunden, a maltster. She was a large woman, and as a consequence of her size, she felt the heat more than most. She was also a woman of great particularity and was constantly admonishing the maid about the details of the housework. In addition, she was something of a brandy bibber. But to be charitable, we can assume that this was to alleviate some sort of illness, because she was also taking poppy water, a not uncommon pain reliever at the time. And as you know, poppy water is also a well-known narcotic. On the morning of the 15th of July, her husband was conducting business in Alton, some 20 miles away, and May suffered a bout of excruciating pain. The maid hurried out to find a doctor. He was not available, so she went on to the local apothecary, who, distracted by the fact that it was approaching dinner time, gave the maid a bottle containing nearly a pint of the liquid instead of the small phial that normally would have been prescribed. Afraid of her mistress's sharp tongue, the maid left the bottle with her and rushed off to catch up with her chores. When at length she did return, she found she could not rouse her. The maid rushed out to find Alice's sister, Anne Penny. Anne thought her sister might be dead, or near so, and sent the maid out for the doctor again. Again, he could not be found for some time, and when he did eventually arrive, he only conducted a perfunctory examination. It was clear, as he saw things, that Alice Blunden was, indeed, dead. Now, there was a real hurry to get the body buried. It was only a few years earlier that there had been a huge outbreak of the plague, and given the intense heat, an immediate burial became essential. With the absence of the husband, it was Anne who made the decision to get her buried at once. A coffin had to be found, and as it so happened, the undertaker had one that had been ordered by a local sea captain, who ended up falling overboard at sea and had never made use of it. This was fine, except for one thing. Alice Blunden was a great deal larger than the previous owner, and the undertaker's men had to apply a considerable amount of force and make use of crowbars to get the body into the box at all. Eventually, though, this was achieved, and the box was hurried through the town, to the Holy Ghost Chapel graveyard. In a matter of a few hours from when Alice had been pronounced dead, a hasty grave had been dug, the coffin lowered in and covered over. When William Blunden returned from Alton, he was somewhat nonplussed to be informed that not only was his wife dead, but she'd already been buried. Quite a homecoming. What was even more extraordinary was the fact that William, instead of hurrying to the graveyard with a hastily improvised posy of flowers from the garden, immediately set out for another business trip to London, leaving Anne Penny to mourn her sister alone. Perhaps, had he spent a few minutes at his wife's graveside, things might have turned out differently. Later, as the shadows lengthened in the churchyard and the excitement had died down, a couple of schoolboys were playing among the graves. Accounts differ as to when this was actually, and some quote anything up to 2 days later. Whenever it was, the boys were shocked when they heard what they took to be a voice crying faintly, "Take me out of my grave! Take me out of my grave!" Terrified, they ran to their schoolmaster, who, being a man of the time, thrashed them both thoroughly before they could convince him to return to the graveyard with them. The sceptical schoolmaster was astonished when he too heard a voice, and so called for help to get the newly dug grave opened again. By evening, the churchyard was in complete pandemonium. The doctor, the vicar, magistrate were all present, and gravediggers were furiously throwing soil out of the grave by the light of lanterns. When the box was finally recovered and opened, it was clear that there had been some attempts at activity within. When the winding sheet was unwrapped, they could observe that Alice had indeed been trying to free herself from the cloth covering her. The doctor performed his usual tricks with looking-glass and feather, but it was now clear to those around that the terror of being confined in such a small place, in such a way, had driven her to the merciful release in suffocation. As the darkness deepened, it was apparent that a storm was brewing, and so the two gravediggers were set to look after the coffin whilst the officials repaired to a local hostelry to hold an inquest on the matter. And no doubt to sample as much of the landlord's best ale, as this hearing lasted well into the small hours. Finally, the storm broke and it began to rain hard. The gravediggers, considering that they were being left out of the jolly proceedings in the pub, screwed the lid back on the coffin, lowered it back in the grave, and covered it over again to protect it from the elements. The next morning, as the clouds lifted, the inquest was resumed at the graveside and the coffin dug up and uncovered once more. The body examined in the cold light of day. But now there was further horror to be witnessed. As a contemporary report has it, they found she had torn off a great part of her winding sheet, scratched herself in several places, and beaten her mouth so long till it was all in gore blood. This time, because of the raging thunderstorm, no one had heard her calls for help. Alice Blunden had been buried alive for a second time. There is no record of how long they waited before she was buried a third time, but I'm pretty sure another doctor was asked for a second opinion. However, this is not quite the end of the story. A court case was held in Winchester to establish whether anyone was responsible for Mrs. Blunden's 2 deaths. The maid, who had not given her mistress due care, the apothecary, who had carelessly allowed such large quantities of poppy water to fall into the hands of the unfortunate woman, the sister for hurrying the proceedings, the doctor for being negligent in his diagnosis, the gravediggers for leaving the coffin unattended, and perhaps, most mysteriously, the husband, William Blunden, who had left for London without even visiting his wife's grave. But as he said later in court, I could mourn just as well in London as I could in Basingstoke. In the end, the justices produced a unique verdict and pronounced the entire community of Basingstoke guilty of the death of Alice Blunden, and the whole town was fined a large sum of money. Well, I hope that 10-minute tale will not give you nightmares, and that you liked it enough to give it a thumbs up on the YouTube channel. And if you subscribe, you will be told when the next 10-minute tale is ready next week. Oh, and a postscriptum, just in case you think it could never happen to you. Only last week there was this story on the BBC. A 50-year-old South African man woke up inside a mortuary over the weekend and screamed to be let out, scaring away attendants who thought he was a ghost. Bye for now.